What up, everyone? Pat Mayo here. I've gathered up a collection of interviews with people from around the fantasy industry, plus other people I just think have cool jobs to tell you their story and how their background got them to where they are today and how they've used those experiences in the past. It's called The Grind, a brand new series produced by the Pat Mayo Experience. Enjoy.
Entering the Pat Mayo Experience.
Pat Mayo Experience. Pat Mayo Experience. Pat Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience. This is the first of a series of interviews with people mainly inside the fantasy industry or broadcasting, but other cool jobs too, finding out how they got to the point where they are now. What is their story? How did they do this? And hey, maybe it can inspire someone to get into it in not necessarily just fantasy or broadcasting, one of these other cool jobs of the guests that I'll have on. But kicking this all off, the co-founder of DailyRoto.com, Drew Dinkmeyer. You're number one. You're the man. Here you are.
I'm excited. I'm honored to be your first, Pat. This is a cool series. This is stuff that I love to listen to. So I'm excited to hear all the other interviews outside of myself. I don't really need to listen to myself anymore, but happy to hear all the other interviews because it's cool to hear people's stories and how they got involved.
Eventually, I'm going to release my story to everyone, but it's all going to be fake news. I'm just going to make it sound as cool as possible. Not how awful it was for so long.
Is it going to be like an X-Men backstory character evaluation, like where you were infused with adamantium and then became the broadcaster that you are now today?
Well, listen, I don't know what you're talking about, Nerdlinger, so probably not. So let's start it out. Where did you grow up, Drew?
So I grew up in South Florida. I grew up in a town that people now know, Parkland, Florida, not a big town. Unfortunately, now known for the mass shooting that happened at my high school, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. But I grew up there in South Florida, raised by two Midwestern parents from Cleveland and from Chicago. So I grew up a Chicago sports fan and have been in Florida most of my life.
So when you start thinking about where you are now, you're in sports, you do daily fantasy. What part of your childhood points to that? Like, are you heavily involved in sports growing up?
Yeah, I love playing sports growing up. I primarily played tennis. My dad played tennis and basketball in college. He went to a small school, Eckerd College in St. Pete, and played both at the collegiate level. My mom played college tennis. So I grew up playing tennis a lot, but I also played soccer and basketball and baseball. And I just loved sports. I loved athletics. I loved competing growing up. And I got into fantasy sports at a really young age. I would say when I was, fourth or fifth grade, I decided to try to start a league with like four other friends. We had a 5-team league in a fantasy baseball draft, and we just all wanted to like be GMs of teams. So this was pre-internet, and we were just doing like hand calculating box scores and different stuff in the papers. To make transactions, you had to call someone else in the league, and at that point, you would like have to hope that you would get somebody instead of like the busy signal, because back then we didn't have like automatically going to voicemails. You had answering machines. So yeah, I got into fantasy sports at a really young age. I just love the concept. I love math, and I love playing sports, and I love the concept and the idea of trying to create my own teams.
So you go through middle school, you go through high school. Where did you go to college?
I went to college, Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, and I was looking at a couple different schools, but Dartmouth gave me the best chance at an education that would set me up kind of for the rest of my life. I was considering William and Mary, which was a school I really wanted to go to, but the tennis coach did not like me at all. Otherwise, I probably would have ended up at William and Mary. I thought that was an awesome, awesome school. And then I was being recruited heavily by Michigan State, where my grandfather went. So there were strong heart ties to try to go to Michigan State, but ultimately just felt like too much of the focus would be on my tennis as opposed to my academics. And at that point in my life, I realized I wasn't going to be a pro tennis player. So I wanted to put a little bit more of the weight and the emphasis on the educational side of my collegiate path.
Well, understanding that you weren't going to be a pro tennis player is probably why you ended up going to the Ivy League school, because most people, if they went on even the lowest level of scholarship or going to play athletics in college, they just assume they're going to make it.
Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of athletes have some level of realistic expectation with them. It probably varies by sport, but I mean, in tennis, like if you're playing college tennis, it's such a small percentage of the population that becomes pro tennis players that played college collegiately. Most guys turn pro when they're 18 and start hitting the tour early. So there were some guys that I competed against, some guys that I played with growing up that went the college route and ended up playing professionally. But it is a harder, or I would say not necessarily a harder route, but generally the really top end players know pretty early on that they're going to be pros and don't necessarily need the collegiate route.
Well, I would think just simply being American would put you at a huge disadvantage in the tennis, in the APT circuit.
Yeah, in some cases, Americans tennis is not at the top of the pecking order in terms of interest and in terms of you're not competing against like the best athletes in the country, because those tend to funnel into other sports. So some of the best athletes in other countries do tend to funnel up into tennis or soccer or different sports that aren't as prioritized in America. So yeah, probably a little bit of an easier player pool to compete against growing up, but probably a tougher path to becoming a pro.
Oh, for sure. Even just seeing even right now, there was the big boom for American tennis, the 80s and throughout the 90s, and just we haven't seen it. It's been like Marty Fish and John Isner. Did you play against James Blake when you were in college?
I didn't. So no, I didn't. And his brother played at Harvard, but we were a few years apart. So I didn't. I did grow up playing with Marty. I did grow up playing with Andy Roddick. There were some other guys like Robbie Ginepri and some other guys that were kind of in my age group. But Andy was obviously the one who kind of carried the torch for American tennis that I grew up playing against. And he trained in Florida. He grew up in Nebraska, or was born in Nebraska, but grew up in Florida and trained in Boca. So I grew up playing and competing against Andy a decent bit.
So we always have these things in our mind like, hey, I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I went to one of the, shout out to my college, one of the crappiest colleges around. Listen, if you played football, you went there. If you played hockey, you went there. Or if you were just like not good at math but wanted to do business anyway. That's what Old St. Mary's could do for you out there. That's my ringing endorsement. Hopefully they give me an honorary doctorate one day. We'll see. But like, what's the transition like going from southern Florida up to the northeast? Obviously, there's going to be weather concerns, but just like, you think Ivy League school, I think like social network and like it's just people around like creating computer programs. Is it that much different than a regular college or university experience?
So I can only compare to, the colleges that my friends attended that I visited. And it is very different than like most of my friends went to state schools. So like University of Florida, Florida State University, Central Florida. I had visited friends at those schools. So I have a little bit of a comparison there, but obviously not a very broad one. I would say first, the weather was a huge issue for me. I had never seen snow. I had grown up in Florida. I had never, ever seen snow. So going to Hanover, New Hampshire, where my recruiting trip was in the fall and I had never seen colors like that before, I was blown away by how beautiful the fall was in New Hampshire. And I'd never seen like elevation because in Florida, everything's flat. So it was just a totally different experience. But when I got to winter, I was so miserable. I never saw the sun. Like I couldn't believe it. I was like, why is the sun never up? It's just like I wake up, the sun's not up. I go to class, the sun's there for like 3 minutes while I walk between my next class. I go to practice, I'm indoors and I'm practicing. I go get food and then I come back and the sun's down already. I never see the sun. It was just ridiculous. And it was also freezing. It was like, constantly below zero with wind chill and stuff. That was a huge, huge learning curve for me. My first college roommate, my freshman year, was from Maine. He had so much fun watching me try to adapt to snow. I remember I dove into a snowbank because I thought snow was fluffy. I fell all the time while trying to walk, and he would just laugh hysterically at me because I had no idea what I was doing. And of course, because I had no idea what I was doing, I had every piece of possible winter clothing you could have, because my parents wanted to make sure I was prepared because they didn't know what they were doing either because we had never lived in this climate. So I had all the most ridiculous, hardcore things, snow pants and everything that I'd rarely use once I figured out what I was actually doing up there.
So you were the coolest kid on campus is what you're saying?
No, very far from
it. So I've always been under the belief, because I went through it in a certain way. I went to university, and then afterwards, after I spent a year out in the world, which was not great, I went back and actually took school seriously again and went to a private college, which is away from where I was from. I went to university in the city where I grew up, and I looked around at all my friends who had gone away for university and got this different experience of, I mean, I lived off campus one year, I lived at home for a bit to save money, that kind of thing. And it feels like everyone that stayed, and not everyone, but I'd say like 80% of my friends who ended up, you know, that I knew from high school or from around the city, that stayed in the city and stayed in their day-to-day life, basically suffered from arrested development for a good like 5 years after everyone else did. The people that went away for college and learned how to, even if they were just doing keggers all the time, they did learn how to get themselves up in the morning to go to class and live on their own, do their laundry, all that stuff. They became adults much quicker. So I think it's very valuable for people to get away from where they're from, if you can afford it. Obviously, not everyone can, and that's why state schools work so well. I mean, in Canada, you can, because university isn't the most expensive thing in the world. Expensive, but, you know, like 5 years at a Canadian college and university, even the really good ones, is basically 1 year of American college, which really blows my mind. I don't quite get it, but this is where we are. But I think that getting away from home and getting out into the world will set you up at least for a quicker transition into real adulthood and actually having a career.
Yeah, I think one of the big benefits for me was going to a school that had people from not only all over the world, but different parts of the country as well. And so, you know, I grew up, I had lived in Florida my whole life. I only kind of knew the lifestyle of what other Floridians live, which, you know, where I grew up is somewhat materialistic and very based around the sun and being outside and different things. And going to a school where a lot of people are from the Northeast or from some people from the Midwest, some people from the South, it did give me a little bit more exposure to, you know, different styles and different upbringings and different cultures. And that for me was one of the big experiences. I probably didn't take my education as seriously as I should have while I was in college, because like once I got there, I just decided like I was going to have fun and I was going to focus on my tennis. I did the exact opposite of what I was planning to do when selecting a school, and that might have backfired a little bit. But I think one of the biggest valuable lessons I got from there was just being able to connect with a bunch of people that just had different backgrounds than me.
So besides the social experience and obviously the sporting experience, what did you end up taking? What did you major in college?
I majored in psychological and brain sciences, which is just a fancy way of saying psych with a little bit of neuroscience. I was my idea when I went in Dartmouth's a liberal arts school. So while you major in something, you take classes in like everything. My original idea was to major in econ and kind of go like the business route, because I thought like that's the route to make a lot of money. And my freshman year, freshman spring, I took my first econ course, and my grandfather passed away that spring, and I flew back and I spent some time at home, and I got way behind on the course. I ended up having to drop the course, and I never kind of went back to econ. But so I ended up doing psych, and that's kind of where my comfort zone is. Both my uncle and my grandfather were professors in graduate level programs in psychology. So my dad's a trained licensed mental health counselor. So I have a lot of background in that area. So it was kind of like a natural, you know, again, I didn't focus enough on my education. So like an easier path for me to kind of get through school.
I always like to look at how the different experiences that people have and what their background is in education, how that applies to what they do now. Do you think that understanding human behavior on sort of a scientific level can allow you to assess daily fantasy any better, just understanding the human behavior of what people are going to do, even if it's whether it's the athletes or whether it's the people that you're physically playing against? Yeah,
the way that I've summed up kind of a psychology degree to all my friends and everybody that I talk to about it is basically it's directly applicable to nothing. It's generally applicable to everything. So like if you want to have like a very specific job with a psychology degree, that's usually just going to be in education. There's not a lot of routes outside of that. But any job you have, a background in psychology is extremely useful in understanding human behavior, how people think through problems, what people's first reactions to things are, what people's biases are to things. And for me, as somebody who's now turned my career into playing daily fantasy sports professionally and then providing content as well, dealing with customers and stuff, understanding how people experience something is very helpful in trying. And then for me as a player, it's extremely helpful in trying to understand like, when you go through extended losing streaks, because that happens even to pros. I know some people might be shocked to hear that because all they see is screenshots of winning thousands of dollars on Twitter all the time. But when you're losing a lot, kind of keeping things in perspective and understanding and trying not to get overly emotional about the situation, and understanding like how your body and your brain are experiencing that situation is very helpful.
Well, it seems like it's a good combination, because you mentioned growing up you were very interested in math, and obviously that's a big part of what you do now is applying the mathematics and the probability to situations as it pertains to daily fantasy, but being able to understand too that with a clear mind and trying not to put too much of your own personal bias in it, that knowing that, hey, losing streaks happen. Winning streaks happen.
Yeah.
A winning streak doesn't make me the best player, that I know everything. And a losing streak doesn't make me a losing streak could mean you're the worst player, but it probably doesn't mean that in certain examples. And even just understanding things like small sample sizes and being able to weather through that with a clear mind and saying, all right, if I just stick to what I'm doing, I trust my process. Mathematically, my process seems to work fine, and that there's just going to be these moments of variance. And some people just don't have a clear enough mind to get through that. They have to completely change what they do just based on impulse.
Yeah, and I think some of that is also, I mean, if you don't have confidence in the process that you're using to play DFS, you're going to be constantly changing your mind on what to do or who to follow, or if you follow a site to try to be a specific person that represents that site, like if you follow Daily Roto to try to be me, then you might just go on the whims of like whatever I'm recommending, as opposed to like trying to figure out your individual process. And that when you know your process, then you have a better chance of being consistent long term. And there's so much variance associated with daily fantasy sports, especially with the GPPs and the payout structures becoming so top heavy, that it takes a lot of time to kind of realize your expectation of how good you are. And so having that background and understanding both in statistics and math and then in psychology, trying to understand and deal with the natural emotional challenges that everybody deals with when they're going through difficult streaks is really, really useful and really valuable. And I tell people all the time, because people ask me about my job and I'll describe it to them and they say, oh, that sounds like the greatest thing in the world. And I'll say, yeah, it really works for me, but you have to have the temperament to do this, because the way I've kind of explained it recently to people is that, you know, if you're a professional DFS player, you're very likely to go through a streak of losing more than $50,000 in a row, or over a course of time. And how you can like handle something like that and understand where you are is a real testament to temperament and kind of understanding of statistics and different things like that. It's not all like, you know, rainbows and unicorns that people think it is by just looking at people's like screenshots on Twitter.
Yeah, but if you're going to sell your product, you got to do those screenshots. That's viral marketing at its finest. That's
the trouble. That's the challenge. And it's unfortunate. We at Daily Roto had tried to like tone down on that type of stuff for a while, but honestly, the marketing isn't nearly as effective. And it's challenging because I think it's challenging at the industry level as well, when so much of the focus and the emphasis is on the prize pools instead of the entertainment value that is created by playing these games. I think you've just guided people in the wrong direction, because only so many people can win. Like, it's a zero-sum game in terms of how many winners there's going to be in the game. And so it's challenging, because then you get people in with like these unrealistic expectations of being able to win so much money, and that's your fault because you've marketed that to them. So it's a really challenging thing, but unfortunately it's the thing that people respond to the most, which is why you see it so frequently if you're following people on DFS Twitter.
Oh, and I am completely guilty of this as well. I think almost everyone who provides any sort of daily fantasy content is. But it's no different than if you were in a different field and be like, hey, here are stock dividends for this quarter. Like, boom, you want to buy this stock. You want to invest in this company. It all kind of trickles down to the same thing of what people react to. And I would think that, you know, with having the background that you have from college, that you just must understand that completely.
Yeah, there's some things in psychology that are like naturally applicable right away to marketing, that you just kind of understand how people react to things and what drives people in terms of sales. But yeah, it's one of these things. Like I said, it's generally applicable to almost every field and almost every interaction that I have. There's something that I can lean on from my background and my educational experiences that I can remember that can be helpful. But in terms of like directly applicable to jobs, the job path of a psychology major is somewhat limited if you're trying to stay within that field.
Well, it's definitely true. It's like I finished with an arts degree with a major in political science, and like, what was I going to do with that? Fortunately, it helped me learn how to research. It helped me learn how to write. It helped me construct arguments. It helped me present my just present any sort of debate in the framework that I want to do and learn both sides of everything. So I think you're right. It's generally applicable to a lot of things, but all a political science degree really does is it can get you an entry-level government job. It can get you on a master's list pretty easily. And then once you get your master's, then you got to go to your PhD. And then you probably got to do something else as well. But you use it as a stepping stone to foster whatever you do next. So you leave college. What do you do after that?
Well, that was a struggling period for me because I spent most of my senior year. I didn't know what I wanted to do because I had this idea that I was going to go down this path of like economics and business, and then I didn't do that. I finished with a psychology degree. I knew I didn't want to do any more education stuff. I didn't want to go to grad school or anything like that. So I really didn't know what I was going to do, and I spent most of my last few quarters on campus, really, honestly, just partying and hanging out as opposed to like doing job interviews and preparing myself. So I left school. I went back home. I had no job. I ultimately ended up getting a job with Morgan Stanley as a financial advisor trainee. So I had to go through the program of, getting the appropriate licenses to become a financial advisor. And when I did those interviews, I talked about things I was interested in terms of like math and analysis. And ultimately what the job ended up being was a sales job, which I really had no interest in doing, but I didn't understand that when I got in. So I kind of like passed all my tests, got all my licenses. And then they were like, hey, here's a phone, start cold calling people. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. So I basically just like putzed around trying to figure out what I wanted to learn in that industry. Met my wife, which was the thing that kept me going into work each day, was this beautiful redhead that I was attracted to. And ultimately, like just putzed around there, figured out I want to do something in finance, but definitely not on the sales side. And I spent most of my time at Morgan Stanley looking for jobs and trying to learn more about the industry. Because I was so afraid to get an account because I was like, I know nothing beyond what I've passed in these tests. Like what happens if I get someone's retirement account and they're like, oh, we'll help you from there. And I was like, I don't want to screw up anybody's retirement. So basically I got fired because I didn't meet my sales quotas, which like I wasn't even trying to do. And then I got a job with a small investment consulting firm doing research and analysis, which was much more up my alley. And I was doing that research and analysis on investment managers. So the people who like run mutual funds or run separately managed accounts that you would invest in, I was doing the research and analysis on those people.
So what is that really, when you research these types of people, like what do you look for? Do you look at the how they deal with their transactions, the rate of what they make them, how risky they are, how profitable they've been over a long term? Is there like different investment strategies that each would employ? And how would you figure out, just knowing, like you just mentioned, like you don't really know much about it going in, are you able to see patterns in these types of things very quickly, or does it take a while to build up to that?
It took a long time for me to figure out what the heck I was doing. And I did more educational training stuff through like some other programs that are offered within the financial industry to like get myself equipped to try to understand what I was looking at a little bit more. And basically what I was doing is a lot of people focus on the quantitative side of things. And what ultimately that will do is when you start looking at people's like trailing 3-year, 5-year returns for benchmarks and different things, almost like most clients will choose whoever has performed the best over the most recent timeframes. And most likely that is the wrong decision because most likely that person's style has just been in favor of late. It's not necessarily that they're adding a ton of value beyond the benchmark and consistently adding value. So the things that I ended up doing once I figured out that like just leaning on the quantitative side wasn't really the answer to things, was kind of leaning on that background that I had in psychology and trying to leverage that. So I developed a little bit more of a qualitative process and interview process with the investment managers, tried to understand more of their team, more of their culture, more of the process around decision making. And then understood within their portfolios if they were sticking to the types of investments that they talked about. So they would talk about their investment process, and we'd write a bunch of notes on it and try to understand their investment process. And then we'd ask them about a lot of individual companies that they invested in and why they invested in them. And if you usually would hear the same type of theme over and over, and that means that they employ a pretty consistent process. And then you can do some quantitative analysis on if the holdings represent those types of investments that they're trying to invest in based on the risk structures and stuff like that. And you start to get a better idea of what managers are at least consistent in their organizational structure and in their processes. And those were the types of managers we were more likely to invest in.
Well, it sounds like that directly translates over to daily fantasy when you kind of just change what the investment is. If you're investing in players' stocks every single day, and you have a consistent approach of, hey, I want to target this value because this is what presents a value as it pertains to baseball on DraftKings or golf on DraftKings or whatever it may be. And having the people with the consistent approach over the long haul are the people that, even if you're if you're a consumer and you're looking at a daily fantasy product to invest in, being like, hey, is this guy just on a hot streak and he's selling me picks? Or do I want to go with the people where they explain their decision making, and their decision making correlates to all the decisions that they make? Even I know this has always been like a contentious thing within the daily fantasy industry, is that someone will say, oh, I'm fading this guy. And it doesn't really mean that they're not using him. It just means that they're, instead of using him 60%, they're using him 10%. And just getting away from that verbiage and that kind of thing. Or like you even mentioned, are they really doing what they say? So if they put out plays, are they actually using those plays? It seems like almost a direct correlation.
Yeah, I learned so much that set me up for the job that I'm in now from that experience. The first thing that I learned first and foremost was that results will vary over different time frames. But if your process sticks to the same thing and it's a good process, over time it will win out. But there will be times that process is just not in favor, that things just are not working out, that the market is not rewarding that. And, as like a deep value investor, there might be times where value just isn't in favor and people aren't focused on those things. People are really focused on growth and different things like that. And so it really helped me understand that if I can develop a really solid process that I believe adds a lot of value over time, there are going to be periods where that process is just not working. And that's okay. And it's not exactly the same in the sense that, stock prices are often driven by like investor sentiment and different things like that outside of the actual production and the earnings, whereas, DFS players aren't driven by investor sentiment in any way, shape, or form. But there are some times during the course of the year where, players that are on quote unquote hot streaks will stay really hot. And the people that invest in or use that as a focal point of their process, like recent performance as a focal point of their process, are going to do a lot better than me because that's not a primary factor for me. And so like kind of understanding that things are going to come in waves really did help set a pretty good foundation for what I do now.
Well, you say it doesn't directly apply outside of like hot streaks or things like that, but I would think in terms of, if we're talking about like large scale GPPs, that like investment in certain players, it's what makes them the chalk. Hey, they're set up for this position. Their recent performance has been really good. And then the market just gravitates all towards the same thing. Well, it might work out. It's probably not always the best solution, is it?
Yeah, and that's actually a great example. So when I was saying it doesn't really correlate, I was thinking to the individual player's performance, but it can correlate to your performance in the sense that, if you're a real contrarian player, there will be times during the course of a season that the chalk keeps hitting and hitting and hitting, and you feel like you're an idiot because you keep playing these contrarian plays that nobody else is on, and you're on this island by yourself, and everybody else is celebrating around you about how brilliant they are, and you're like, man, I am just lost. And for me, I have started to try to do that a little bit more in certain sports where I feel the variance is really high, like golf, for example. And so I've been struggling with that this year, where it seems like the players that I'm on that are contrarian just haven't been coming through at a high enough rate. And in golf, because it's only once a week, 4 weeks of bad golf feels like months, because it is. And so it's a different experience, but kind of understanding that there are going to be times during the course of the season where players who play really chalky players are going to get rewarded. There are going to be courses and nights during the season where players that play really contrarian players are going to be rewarded. And I'm not sharp enough to jump between the two. So I'm going to stick to my process, and I'm going to try to hope to capitalize on those nights that, depending on the sport, some sports I play chalkier, some sports I play more contrarian. But depending on the sport, that those nights that the way I'm playing is rewarded, I should be taken care of as well.
Well, when you're someone who approaches it as a pro and you have a bankroll to deploy on this, you're not the casual person investing $40 or $20 into trying to win $1 million or win $100,000 on a weekend. Is this why you lean more towards cash games over giant field tournaments?
That's what I have historically done. It's becoming more and more challenging to do that over time because the strength of the player pool in cash games is getting more and more challenging. Certainly, I'm and other content providers and projection providers are responsible for that. So I have no one to blame but myself there. And the pools, what you need when that happens is you need the field sizes to grow. So you need more like 100 person 50-50s or double ups or different things like that. And what we've seen is they've actually condensed a little bit. They're more consistently 11s or 22s or different things. And so those are filled up with stronger and stronger competition. So as I get through this, I had leaned on cash games for a long time. I'm playing a little bit higher percentage of GPPs now than I ever have. And I'm focusing a lot more on game selection than I ever have. Just really trying to make sure that I'm playing in games where I feel like I do have an edge. If I'm playing in a game with 21 other pros and there's 22 of us total, I probably don't have an edge that I'm probably going to be beating the site fees over the long term. So trying to really pick my spots a little bit better to make sure that I can stay profitable. So
you go into this job, and how long are you there for?
I was at Morgan Stanley for a year. That was the 1 year training. And then I was at what ended up being, we started with Shot Group, and then we transitioned to Cap Trust. And I was with Cap Trust and Shot Group for about 8 years.
So how does your job evolve over year 1 to year 8?
It evolved a lot. When we were Shot Group, we were really small, but we had, quite a bit of assets under management. Our focus was a niche focus with Catholic dioceses. So we were handling a lot of the investments for Catholic dioceses, and they wanted to invest in a socially responsible manner. So it involved us making sure that their investment managers weren't investing in like tobacco stocks and other, whatever their ideals were, abortion-related stocks, whatever the Catholic Church's ideals were. And so when we were really small, my job was a little bit more client focused. I was wearing multiple hats. I was doing client service stuff. I was doing research and analysis. I was doing some like small consulting level work as well. As we merged to a higher group and we had like more resources and a bigger staff, my role became a little bit more focused, and it was mostly just research and analysis. And by the end of it, I had graduated to like a senior level investment research analysis, and I was kind of managing our team of other analysts and managing responsibilities. While I had my own individual asset classes that I was responsible for, I was also trying to help coordinate as kind of the lead analyst with everybody else, what asset classes they were managing. I helped develop the process that we came to put together, both qualitative and quantitative, that we would then present to our investment committee on any recommendations we had. And my recommendations as I got further along in the process were more high conviction recommendations. When I first started out, I was recommending a lot of managers that were like kind of enhanced indexes. Like they owned a lot of stocks. They weren't really adding a ton of value beyond the benchmark year after year, but they were consistently adding a little bit. And then by the time like I finished, I was recommending a lot of like 40 to 50 stock portfolios of like high conviction managers that I thought were going to add a lot of value, but were going to be volatile over time. And bringing those to the table with our investment committee. So there's a lot of evolution in the job, not only in my responsibilities, but in my preferences and my behaviors as well.
Well, how, from year 1 to year 8 and understanding how this entire process works and becoming more familiar with everything, how does your understanding of data really come into this over time? You learn how the system works, you learn the patterns, learn what you're looking for, but an actual analyzing of all of this, how important was that?
I think it was helpful. I think the first thing I'd say is most people, when they hear I've worked in finance before, they immediately think of the quantitative side of things. They think, oh, that guy must have been doing a lot of modeling and spending all his day in Excel. And that was, nothing could be really further from the truth, honestly. It was a lot of qualitative work in the job that I was doing specifically. But understanding the variance associated with data really hit home while I was going through the process of analyzing managers. And the more interested I got in higher conviction managers with smaller portfolios, the more I recognized how one specific blip on a stock could have a huge impact on potential returns and different things like that. So I started understanding like, okay, this calendar year, they had a big struggle. Why was that? And then you look into the portfolio and you look at the individual holdings and you see like one stock really put a lot of pressure on that portfolio. And why did it do that? What came under the gun? And how did they deal with that process? So for me, most of the work that I did was qualitative in nature, but a lot of the work that I got out of it was in seeing and understanding just how data and how numbers can kind of be not, I don't want to say twisted, but can kind of how you can get to a result that looks very different than the process might suggest. And that was really beneficial for me setting the stage to get into DFS.
Well, I think that it plays a lot into narrative as well. Like you look at the results, someone builds a narrative or a story around it. Like, hey, this guy did very poorly because he lost money right here. Well, why did that happen? So understanding why that happens would be an essential part of the process, especially as it pertains to DFS. So how close are we getting into you putting down some money and playing daily fantasy sports?
So as I had mentioned, like I loved playing fantasy sports growing up. So I played fantasy sports through high school. I played through college. Through college, it was a great way for me to stay in touch with my dad. My dad was my tennis coach growing up, and he wanted to make sure that he was available to me as a tennis coach, but I had a tennis coach when I was in college. So he didn't want to like step on anyone's toes. And so we played fantasy sports as a team together. We would co-own a bunch of teams and play leagues together. So I had been playing fantasy sports throughout this time period. I had started writing at a site called Fantistics, either known as Insider Football or InsiderBaseball.com. Anthony Perry gave me my first opportunity there. Forever grateful for him for giving me that opportunity. And I had started writing on that site just as on the side as fun. Like I just enjoyed it. And as I kept kind of getting into fantasy sports, I saw that there were opportunities with like high stakes leagues. I started to try to play those because ultimately, while I liked my job and I thought my job was a cool job, it wasn't a passion. It wasn't something I got up every morning and I was super excited to do. It was a grind. And I wanted to see if there was any way that I could create a path in something that I woke up every day excited to do, which was fantasy sports. I mean, I dreamed of being Matthew Berry or Nando DeFino or anybody that I read about in Fantasyland or anybody that I'd followed all their columns, Brad Evans and Steve Alexander and like all these people that I'd followed for years and years and years. And I wanted to, like, I knew there weren't many jobs out there to do that, but I wanted to see if there was any way I could kind of create that type of job. So I was writing on the side with Fantistics. I then one year decided I'm going to try to play a ton of high stakes seasonal fantasy leagues and see if I can create any sort of edge there. So I played like 40 season long baseball leagues. By the end of that season, I was dead. Like my brain was fried. I could not, like, it was impossible to manage. I was like, I'm never going to make it in fantasy sports. It's never going to happen. There's no route here for me. And then I just got a random email from a Fantastic subscriber that asked me who was the best pitcher that day. And I responded, whatever. Next day, same thing. And I responded again, next day, same thing. And I was like, I really don't understand what kind of league you're in that you can just pick up the best pitcher of the day each day and play them, or like you trading for them each day. I just didn't understand the concept. He's like, no, I'm playing daily fantasy sports. So I looked into it and I saw, ads for Draft Street, and I saw ads for this guy Hicksville Hunk turning $60 into $6,000. And I was like, oh, well, that guy can do it. I can do this. I'm really good at fantasy sports. So I signed up on Draft Street and I put my $60 in and I played all of my $60 on the first day. And I think I won the first day, but then I had like $100 and I played all my $100 the next day and then I lost and I was out. I was like, okay. And then I just kept doing that like 4 or 5 times. I had no concept of bankroll management. I just didn't understand anything that was going on. So it took me through a number of deposits to like figure out what the heck was going on, figure out and understand the games. And then over time, I started to see results that made me think maybe there's something here. And when I started to see those results, I also recognized that, hey, I'm providing content in the season-long space. I do not see many people providing content in the daily space. And most of the daily space stuff that I see is all like batter versus pitcher stats and stuff like that, which on larger scale samples has proven to be inconclusive in predictiveness. So I was like, I think I can add a lot of value here. And that's when I started talking about it with Mike Leone, who was also a writer at Fantistics at the time. And the two of us had been trading a bunch of notes each day on daily fantasy and different plays that we were making and different stuff. And that's when we decided to maybe start a content business together.
So just to scale back a little bit before getting into daily fantasy, when you start writing and you read, like, how do you even reach out to someone to start writing for a site? Like, do you write like articles that no one has ever seen to get better at it? Or do you just write one article one day, email it to Anthony? He's like, hey, I like this. You're writing now.
Yeah, so I was a subscriber to Fantistics for a few years. We had found, my dad and I just love their draft software, and we used it all the time. And so I saw a link on their site that basically said, like, do you love sabermetrics? Do you want to be the next Billy Bean? Do you want to write for our site? And I was like, yeah, I want all those things. So I applied and I got a response back pretty soon. I submitted some writing samples, and they were stuff that just like, they were like player analysis stuff, that how I would write about a player. and I got the opportunity. And gosh, I was probably writing with Fantastics for like, I want to say 5, 6, 7 years before transitioning over to starting the focus on daily fantasy.
So the entire time that you do this, and this is the sneaky part about fantasy and getting into the fantasy industry, were you ever paid a cent?
Yeah, we were paid. Not very well, but we were paid.
That's actually shocking to me that you were paid at all.
Yeah, no, we were paid. Anthony did pay us. We were paid, gosh, I want to say like $30 per set of blurbs, like on like 25 blurbs.
That's not bad, actually.
No, it was good. It was like I would make, over the course of the year, I'd make a couple $1,000s writing about fantasy sports. I love doing it, but I mean, it was also clear at the time that like there's not much of a path here to do this professionally. Like I can't write enough blurbs to make it happen. And there's not enough money in the industry at the time to support tons and tons of jobs in the industry. But yeah, Fantastics did pay, and I was happy to work for the amount that I was getting paid. So after you started writing for daily fantasy, was it just baseball at first? And when did that branch out into other sports and providing content for that? Yeah, so Mike and I talked with Anthony about it, and we're like, hey, we think there's an opportunity here. So we started this site, My Fantasy Fix, which now some of the other Fantastics writers are still running. And it was supposed to be just daily fantasy oriented. And we started with baseball. But what we realized is if we're going to do this and try to make a career out of it, we really need to expand beyond baseball and football, which were the two sports that Fantastics had supported for years and years and years. They had not done basketball. And I obviously I've had a huge passion for basketball forever. So we kind of decided, hey, we really need to figure this out. And if we're really going to do this right, we need kind of a big tech investment on this as well. Like we need more dedicated resources. Mike and I are willing to work for whatever revenues we can generate, but we need a lot of support. And at that point, we just decided Anthony wasn't so sure that it was a great fit. We weren't so sure that we were going to be able to get the amount of resources that we really need. So we started looking around. That's when we ended up working with Roto Experts and kind of transitioning over to the daily side there. And at that point, we realized, look, we need to have every sport that we can covered. So we need to do football, baseball, and basketball to have a chance to generate enough subscriptions to really make this, to be able to live off this. Because we were both taking a big step. I left my job completely to do this, and Mike was transitioning out of his job at the time to try to do this full time as well.
So had you had any big daily fantasy caches at that point to help sustain yourself a little bit? Because leaving your job to go into fantasy full time and creating a website is it takes a lot of confidence, probably a little bit of stupidity as well. Having that blind faith in yourself that, hey, I can do this. This is going to work. But also being you and analyzing risk and understanding a lot of the psychology, knowing that, hey, this is not a guarantee. This is something that is incredibly risky. So it's impressive to have that sort of confidence. That's something that you see across the industry is people with a lot of self-belief that what they're going to do is going to work out. But had you had success in the daily fantasy space in terms of a player, that allowed you to say, hey, I am really good at this.
I had, but the confidence took a lot of time to get there. So I'd had 2 consecutive years of making enough money, which what I thought at the time was enough to make like, a minimum salary that I could say, if I can win this playing, I'm okay. I was fortunate enough to have a very supportive wife who, at the time, fiance, who was making very good money in her own profession, and we were going to be okay. So I was able to take the risk because of not only her support, emotionally, but her support financially, that she was in a really good spot and we were going to be able to figure it out. We were going to be okay. So not everybody is lucky enough to have that kind of person alongside them for this journey. I was very fortunate there, but I had 2 consecutive years of playing. Now the industry was very different at that point. GPPs were not huge by any means. Basically, I was just grinding cash games really, really hard. And I was one of the players that, was kind of flooding every game on Draft Street at the time. Draft Street was primarily where I played. I played a little bit on FanDuel, and a little bit on some other smaller niche sites that are no longer around, but mostly on Draft Street, which is also no longer around. And most of my wins were just cash game grinds. I did in 2012 or 2013, I think I won a GPP. oh my gosh, on Daily Joust. I was blanking on the site for a second. On Daily Joust, that was like I don't know, like probably a 4-digit win, like 10,000 plus, and that did help build the bankroll. So I was able to kind of funnel that into GPPs a little bit more. But it was very different than the industry is now, where the prize pools are incredibly big. Cash games are probably a lot tougher definitely a lot tougher to grind now than they were then. And while you can win life-changing money, you're also competing against a lot stronger players now than you were then. Back then, I mean, certain days you were playing against people in cash games, even in high stakes, that were playing people that were injured. Like they just the level of analysis and the level of like research that was done was just nothing compared to what it is now. So it was very different back then.
So when do you see daily fantasy as having taken off? When did these prize pools start becoming significant? When did it breach over into the season-long player and say, hey, I'm playing fantasy football now. I want to play a daily game twice a year, and then that becomes 4 times a year, and then people just give up season-long and just start playing daily full-time. Like, when do you see that shift happening?
Yeah, so I saw early on that this was going to happen at some point. I didn't know when, and I didn't know how aggressive the sites would be in trying to raise their prize pools. And I didn't know which would happen first in terms of people converting and being interested in daily fantasy, because it made all the sense in the world. Daily fantasy does have a lot of the fun things around it that are better than season long, in terms of like the season long mechanics of like working the waiver wire and different things like that just aren't as fun. And it has the draft aspect that people like every day. But I didn't know which would come first, which the interest from the season-long people transitioning over, or the prize pools rising aggressively. And it turned out that it was more of the prize pools rising aggressively first. And DraftKings was the one who really pushed that envelope early on with their business acumen, in terms of trying to offer a lot of overlay early on in bigger prize pools than people were accustomed to, knowing that would bring people to the fray. So I would say that really started to happen probably in 2013, right around the time that I was transitioning into providing content. It started to become clear that, hey, this industry has a little bit of runway to it. I don't know how much, but enough certainly that I've seen other people be able to create, maybe not, crazy money-making businesses in fantasy sports in terms of providing content, but make nice livings for themselves that they want to do. Maybe I can be that guy in daily.
If Black Friday in poker never happens, and online poker is easily accessible to everyone in America, which it is not. It is for everyone else worldwide. I have no doubt that daily fantasy still would have been big, but I don't think it would have been this big, because we saw a lot of people from that poker industry come over to daily fantasy. And I'm not just talking about the players in general, but the tech people, the people that understood how to process transactions online. There was already that built-in infrastructure, and then these people had nothing to do. Do you think that helped accelerate the growth of daily fantasy to a point that it allowed it to get to the level that it is right now?
Absolutely. I think there's no denying that, both on, as you said, on a player acquisition side, but also on a lot of the people who were developers, in terms of understanding the gaming space a little bit and what customers would like, both from, like in UI and interactive capabilities and different things like that. So without a doubt, I still think this industry would have eventually been successful as an industry, because I think the idea itself is very innovative and very cool, and I think it has a runway to it. But size would have been a very different conversation. And maybe we'd be a totally different industry, because the opportunity set wouldn't have been so perceived as so large, and so maybe the growth wouldn't have been pushed so aggressively. There's a lot of different paths you could go. Trying to think through that one if poker was legal the whole time. Yeah,
well, I just remember growing up, there would be the Sunday Millions on Poker Stars. That was like the one tournament name that I actually did. I think that DraftKings did a very smart thing in incorporating these larger prize pools, just giving them catchy names that describe what it was. Like, hey, the Millionaire Maker. That makes a lot of logical sense to me. I mean, for you, being a former Millionaire Maker winner, you probably like that term a lot too, right?
Yeah, It's a contest that brings a lot of attention to the industry, and I think it's the contest that is probably the most responsible for growth in the industry. I think as you get further along into the contest, and you think more and more about like the payout structures and different things like that, it's a contest that's very difficult to be successful in long term. unless you happen to run into the one really good week, which I obviously was fortunate enough to do. But I definitely think the idea of like branding those contests and the idea, even when daily fantasy was going well, when I was playing, the idea that there would be $1 million contest, let alone $1 million first prize, was so far off. I thought that was like a 2018 to 2023 type timeline. And I won the Millionaire Maker in 2014. So they were very aggressive in trying to promote that aspect of the prize pool, and that I think that definitely led to a lot of people being more interested in DFS than they would have been before.
Do you think it helps too that when someone like you who provides daily fantasy content and is known within the daily fantasy space wins a Millionaire Maker, like when Pete wins a Millionaire Maker or when Al won the Millionaire Maker, that helps, or do you think that hurts? Because I personally think it helps. It's like when I would tune in to watch the World Series of Poker. If Phil Hellmuth was at the final table or Phil Ivey, I'd be like, oh, hey, I'm going to watch this. I want to get into this. But if it was just 9 schmoes I never knew about before, I'd be like, maybe I'll watch, maybe I won't. I always think it's better that known quantities win these things. Now, I hope that I win, and listen, if anyone can win, that's great. But for the growth of the business and the growth of the industry, I always think that's something to point to. Be like, hey, these guys are invested. These guys study this every day. They play every day. And look, they won these big contests. And if you see more and more people like that, the game of skill conversation just really rises, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think there's certainly some downside to it, which, we can talk about the small downsides to it as well.
Well, the downside is very clearly, hey, why would I play in this if these guys are so good and just going to win every time?
Right. So that's the downside to it. And I think the original idea that, DraftKings saw with seeing this and marketing this as a game of skill, which I still to this day believe clearly it's a game of skill, because it took me a long time to improve and keep getting better at it. And I'm still having to adapt and get better at it every single day to be able to stay on pace with what I had done in the past and different things. But I think, early on, DraftKings realized that, and that, again, from the experience of the poker era, in recognizing that, hey, if you can create credible personalities around this sport, that will interest people in continuing to follow it, and also interest and give people a path, give people an idea of, hey, if you work really hard at this, you might be able to achieve these types of levels. And I think that's very valuable in terms of trying to draw people in. So that was one of the things DraftKings did with like the DraftKings Pros programming that they put together, where Al, Pete, David Kitchen, myself were part of a team that were providing sweat shows and different things like that, and trying to provide some educational material, little quick hitting videos and different things. And I think that was a really good idea in terms of trying to put a person, like a real life person, as somebody that a new customer could look to and say, hey, like that person's background, I understand, Pete was in finance, Drew was in finance, Al was a poker player. These people have a background in mathematics and gaming and stuff like that. And if I want to learn that background, maybe I can be successful as well. I think that was innovative and important. Maybe I'm biased and maybe it's a little bit narcissistic to think it was important, but I do think it helps create a path in terms of allowing people to understand that, hey, like this is a game of skill. If you work really hard at it, you're not guaranteed to be successful, but you have more of a route to be successful because these other people have been able to do it as well.
So when you and Mike are at Fantasy Fix, are you charging subscriptions for that product?
Yeah, we were charging subscriptions for that product. I honestly don't even remember what we were charging at the time. I don't think it was very much. We were just happy to be doing it, honestly. But the two of us were writing content every single day. And this was before we had developed like really sophisticated projection systems. This is before we had, put a bunch of tech resources into making sure those projection systems were available for people to see and different stuff. We were just like writing picks and analysis and like giving ideas on why players are more likely to be better than others. And I remember one of our subscribers early on in one of the first live events pulled me aside and said, hey, I subscribe to you guys because I heard you on SiriusXM talking about an individual game, and Bronson Arroyo was on the mound and he was facing the Brewers, and everybody else on the channel was talking about stacking the Brewers that day because Bronson Arroyo gives up all these home runs. And you said, hey, that Brewers lineup has 8 right-handed bats in it, and Bronson Arroyo is actually pretty good against right-handed bats. I'd rather play Bronson Arroyo. And that was the kind of analysis we were giving. We were very platoon heavy at the time, which most people at that time weren't. So that's the things we were talking about. But it was a grind, man. I remember I would wake up at the time I also lived about an hour away from my job, so I would wake up at like 7, commute into work, get to work by like 8:30, 9, work from like 9 to or 8:39 to like 6, then set my lineups from 6 to 7, then drive home, get home at like 8, eat dinner, write a column till like 11:30, 12, go to sleep and do the same thing. And I did that over and over again. I did that for like 2 or 3 months and then my wife pulled me aside and said, look, you can't live like this. You need to make a decision on what you're going to do, and I'm going to support you in whatever you do, but you cannot do this. And that's what ultimately got me to move away from doing my job full time.
If you didn't have the support system in place coming from your wife, and I even look at myself, I didn't have a support system in place from my family giving me a small leash in order to pursue a dream like this, do you think it's viable to take a stance saying, hey, I'm going to be in the fantasy business? Because I don't know if it is.
I would have never done it. There's no chance I would have ever done it. I still needed convincing, even when she had all her support behind me. I needed convincing from one of my very good friends who's an entrepreneur, who I went to college with, and he's been a very successful entrepreneur. I was always nervous. I thought in my mind, I'm just going to grind out, a mid-level job and make decent money and just kind of grind out my life doing that. I'm working, 9 to 6 every day. And we had a long conversation on a layover. He was flying through Fort Lauderdale and he was overnight on his way to, I believe, Chile. And we had a long conversation about the benefits of being an entrepreneur and trying to create your own life for yourself. But without that kind of support, not only from my wife, from a financial level, but from friends and family, my parents were very supportive of me trying to take that step as well. I wouldn't have done it because I was too scared. I mean, it was a big risk and I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And I didn't know if I could get back on track if I got off the track. Like, I didn't know if I got out of finance, if I could ever get back in, because I live in South Florida and there's not a lot of finance jobs in South Florida. It's not like living in New York or living in Boston or some of the other areas that there's, more opportunities available. There weren't a lot. So I was pretty nervous about the whole thing.
I think you kind of brought it up. Talking to an entrepreneur is probably great because it seems like getting into daily fantasy or even starting your own content or becoming a full-time player, whatever it is, it kind of encapsulates the entire entrepreneurial spirit that goes into building something that's your own.
Yeah, it does. And that's a good thing and that's a bad thing as well. The amount of hours that you will pour into something that is yours is at times never ending. At times it feels like your baby in terms of trying to take care of stuff. And it can be very, very stressful at times. But what it does create when you kind of have the things humming in the way that you do is it creates a really flexible lifestyle that allows you to do the things that you wanted to do. And for me, that was always a goal of mine. I was very lucky that, my dad worked a lot of jobs, but he was always around. He taught tennis. He was a licensed mental health counselor. He wrote books. He did all these things, but he was always around for my childhood. And I really, if I'm lucky enough to have a kid one day, and my wife and I hope to have a kid, I want to really be involved and I want to really be around and be a really good dad and be a really good parent. And I had the benefit from both my parents being around a lot in my childhood, and I wanted to provide that. So that was ultimately the motivating goal that got me to kind of choose this path, because this was the only way that I saw that really happening.
One of the big questions that people always ask me, and I can give an easy answer because I'm not any good, but if you're so good at daily fantasy, Drew, why do you do content? Why don't you just play?
Yeah, so the first answer is I got a little bit out in front of myself in terms of, hey, I was so scared of kind of taking this leap by myself. I needed some level of income to offset some of that fear. So I kind of took this first from the viewpoint of like, hey, we're going to do this to try to support a basic level of income. I had no idea how big the industry would grow, what my capacity in terms of being able to make money in the industry would be based on liquidity and stuff. So I kind of started from that mindset. The other thing that I'd mention is I'm from a family of educators. My uncle and my grandfather were both professors. I liked, my dad was a tennis coach. I liked teaching. I liked being involved and trying to help other people. I also recognized that I thought there was an opportunity that not everybody's going to have the same amount of time to be able to put into researching and doing these things. People have jobs, people have families. And if this entire industry is going to grow, it needs those people to play, and those people to play with some level of confidence, that they feel like they have something in their heads to help them make the right selections. So I got into it because I needed it to start, because I needed that that kind of layer of income to start. But eventually I kind of realized like, this is a need in an industry. Every single industry has some level of consulting associated with it to try to improve the industry and to try to make things better. And I feel like that was going to happen regardless. I felt like I was a person who could do it responsibly and do it well. And I felt like I was a person that could bring a pretty good voice to it alongside Mike, with both of us having, a teaching background as well in our families. Mike's married to a teacher as well. So I think we both highly value the educational aspect. And then the other thing that as you play more and more, you realize that this game is very lonely. DFS, you are grinding by yourself a lot during the course of the day. So to be able to share some of your success with other people and to be able to help other people to their own success is really rewarding. And I know, Pat, because I have been in your shoes many times. I know for you, it is just as rewarding, if not more, when you win something as it is when you get a tweet from somebody that says, hey, I cashed this Danny Willett ticket because you and Jeff made this great call at the Masters a few years ago. Thank you so much. This was an unbelievable experience. Couldn't thank you guys more. That kind of response that you get from somebody is extremely rewarding and satisfying.
Oh, it's probably the best part about I do like sitting in front of a camera and moving my hands around and talking, and I enjoy the entire process of broadcasting, producing multimedia. That's where my interest really lies when it comes down to it. And I love talking about fantasy. I love sports and everything like that, but that sort of stuff actually makes it somewhat rewarding because, this can be a very lonely thing too. People think, hey, people see you and people listen to you, but it's really just me talking into a camera and me talking into a microphone with potentially someone else on the other line. So making it as fun as possible and as rewarding as possible is a big key to having. I think it helps sustain success too, because it keeps you motivated to go forward as well. Now, the time that I first met you, I believe it was at an FSTA conference in Vegas, right when Roto Experts brought you guys in to launch Daily Roto. I met you, I met Mike, and I met Adam Hummel all at the same time. And that's right around the same time that fantasy had first started too. I remember Nando and I were there doing we interviewed you outside. We were trying to get the lighting right. And it was really, it's probably still on YouTube if people want to go look it up. But that was my first encounter with you. So what made you come over besides Lou probably like selling you the world and being like the most convincing guy ever on everything to come over and partner up with Roto Experts?
Yeah, so it was a funny story because I didn't really know much about Roto Experts. I didn't use any of their seasonal stuff at the time, and so I didn't really have much of a connection there. But I'd been working on SiriusXM, and when you're on SiriusXM, like we were doing the show for Fantistics, but you do a lot of host leagues and you do a lot of other spots on other shows to try to promote your show, so you get to know the other hosts. And Roto Experts had a lot of content on SiriusXM, and Tony Sincata was the guy who I'd done a lot of guest spots with, and Tony was always so kind and so generous, and would always promote us so heavily. And so when I talked, I was kind of, quietly, Mike and I were kind of like looking around, and I mentioned to Tony, hey, we're thinking about making a move here. And Tony said, do not do anything before you talk to Lou. Let me set this up. And Tony was really, really generous in his descriptions of myself and Mike. And Lou was really generous in his willingness to kind of help and suggested, hey, we've got this tech infrastructure built for you. We have this distribution infrastructure built for you. We have these great people like Pat Mayo that make all these videos that people like to watch, and that brings in an audience. And it made sense for us at the time that we were going to be able to do our own thing. They didn't have a daily side at the time, so we were going to be the featured group. And I think that was really important to us as well, so that we weren't like competing amongst ourselves with other people. And so it allowed us to have our voice. And I think that was the thing that was most important, was we were going to be able to do things the way that we wanted to. And so at the time, I was like really, and looking back at this is probably silly, but I really didn't want optimizers and stuff like that on our site, because I didn't want people just coming to a site, clicking a button and walking away. I wanted people engaging with the content and trying to learn and understand the process. And so for years, we didn't have optimizers on our site when everybody else in the industry did, because I was stubborn and I thought, hey, I really want people to learn how to play the game as opposed to just come here and like push buttons and get a result and then place all the emphasis on the results. Because I want all our subscribers to just love playing the game. I want the entertainment value to be the focal point, and then hopefully we're helping them win money alongside as well. So that's what kind of got me into Roto Experts, was being able to have that vision in our own hands, essentially.
Well, what I think you guys did a really good job of creating from the outset, and I think even Adam, along with Lou Dogs, helped this a lot, was creating a community of players, people that could discuss things back and forth, because winning's great. Everyone wants to win, obviously, but creating a community along with it, I think, too, I think a lot of Tommy when I think of it too, and what Guru Elite has done. You guys are sort of the polar opposites, but you're both creating a community in very much the same way, I think.
Yeah, no, I think Guru Elite has been pretty genius in their marketing aspects of like the Elite Mafia and the things that they've done to connect people. Because as I said before, this is a lonely game, and people who are playing want to feel connected to others as well. So that was a big reach for us in terms of partnering with Lou Dogs, with Adam and his site, and trying to create that community. And I think that's ultimately like, I spend most of my day that I'm not working in Slack, hanging out with our subscribers, talking about plays, talking about games, talking about sports, talking about all sorts of things. And I think that is what, creates relationships and friendships. And I'm now, I'm quite a few years into this. So I'm now used to the fact that a lot of my friends are people that I do not see in person very often, that I communicate with over the internet all the time. And that's very much what I do with our subscriber base as well.
So I guess the hardest part that I found for a lot of people, and it's why I'm sitting here right now, because I got on my sort of you got into daily fantasy early. You could capitalize on that being very good at the ground level. In terms of radio broadcasting and video broadcasting in the fantasy space, there just was none. And anyone who was capable at doing it, all of a sudden, you started having jobs. That was the little niche to get in. That was a paying part. Daily fantasy was a paying end of the industry. Video was a paying end of the industry. But now it seems like if you're going to be a writer, you also need to be a podcaster in radio, on video. And you might not necessarily need to know how to actually do the multimedia production of everything, but at least be capable on camera or capable speaking into a microphone. How do you articulate your points? So after you're writing and you're being a daily fantasy player, you do some spots on Sirius. How difficult is the transition into video, into the broadcasting elements of this?
Well, it's mostly difficult because I'm not a very handsome man.
Oh,
so moving into video,
the self-deprecation's not going to work here.
But no, it was. I remember the first I did radio shows on Sirius XM. Beyond spots, I actually did full, multi-hour shows, and I remember the first show I did on Sirius, I had the producers in my ear, and I was working with Lou Blasi, who's such a great mentor and such a great friend that kind of helped guide me through the radio experience, because he had broadcasting experience, and he made it so easy for me. He just said, look, I'm going to set you up. You just talk with your analysis, talk with your numbers. People are going to like you. And he gave me so much confidence. And then the producers were so great. Phil Backer, Chris Chion.
The Big Chi.
Everybody that I worked with at Sirius was so nice to me and so helpful in making that transition so much less scary than it was, because I had never done any of this stuff. I don't have nerves around public speaking, which helps a lot for me. So there wasn't a hurdle in terms of a fear to get over there, but allowing me to get all those reps with the confidence that people gave me behind them really set me up to be able to transition into doing podcasts, into doing video, into doing all these things and feeling comfortable, because I had so many hours logged, really with training wheels on, because I was supported by everyone else around me, with the producers and Lou as just an unbelievable person to kind of guide me along that journey. But yeah, it's a different industry now. I mean, you need to be comfortable in written. You need to be comfortable in audio. You need to be comfortable in visual. And while you might not need all the production aspects, man, does that give you a leg up if you can do all that stuff in terms of being able to edit video, to be able to bring in graphics, to be able to do all the stuff that you do. And I think you've been a little bit of a trailblazer in that sense, where I see now a lot more people who have those multi skill sets to be able to bring to the table, that are starting to create paths for themselves, like, the Podfather and Fantasy Mansion and some other people in the industry. And it's really cool to watch. It's really cool to see, because the industry it didn't scale as big as everybody probably hoped. And that means that there's not as many jobs as everybody hopes within it. But it does mean that there's an opportunity that if you can create a really cool, unique skill set that you can use in a lot of diversified ways, you can make yourself really, really valuable. And I think you've created that path for a lot of people, Pat.
Well, I hope so. And yeah, the industry isn't quite to where everyone wants it to be, and there's only a limited amount of jobs, but I do think that creates a acceptable amount of competition between all these jobs, and finding a unique voice or something unique to talk about really presents a great opportunity for someone. If they can find their lane and do that really well, it's going to flood the industry with different voices, which is all you can ever want. The worst thing that could ever happen is people telling you the same thing every time you tune it on. Then it turns into ESPN and Fox, where they're just shouting at each other the entire time, just for the sake of shouting at each other. And it seems like there's a more nuanced way to talk about fantasy, and it seems like the production aspect is catching up to that, and that's really good to see, and it keeps me on top of my toes. I mean, if people are catching up to my level of production, that means I need to up my level of production just a little bit more to stay a little bit ahead. So that sort of stuff is inspiring to see people come around. It's funny you mentioned, you said you were never scared of public speaking, anything like that. Neither was I, until I started doing video shows. And then I was the best man at a wedding. And I started and I went to one of Al's DFS boot camps and went out there. And it was the most terrifying thing I think I've ever done. It's really bizarre that I went from just talking into a camera and speaking pretty plainly, pretty comfortably. When I get up there, it's not that I can't speak. I don't know where to look, because I'm used to looking right ahead at a camera. And now when I do public speaking, like I emceed a wedding, I just picked a spot in the back of the room and just stared at that and started talking. And that helped me get overcome what am I doing? Do I have to look over here and scan the room as I'm trying to tell jokes? I don't know.
That's funny you mentioned that, because I have a friend who, one of my closest friends, who just recently got engaged, and I know I'm going to have give a speeches, but he doesn't even have a wedding date, and I'm already sweating, making sure that speech is what it needs to be for the right moment. And I'm already when I go to bed each night, trying to think of different topics that I could, I'm probably a year out from this, and I'm already starting to sweat it a little bit. So maybe that'll be the same case for me. Maybe I won't be quite as crisp as I was before after having all these experiences on camera. Well,
I mean, you can reach out. I know this might sound like bad advice, but trust me, it's good. Reach out to one Mr. Tim Andercust, who is the king of best man speeches.
That is mind-blowing to me. That is just absolutely mind-blowing.
Making people cry in the room.
Incredible.
I mean, as a college professor, he has a lot of experience speaking in front of a lot of people, so he's very comfortable. But it was mind-blowing how good he was at
it. That is incredible to me. One thing you did mention there when talking about the finding your own voice, I think is so important if you're trying to break into this industry. And I will give all the credit in the world for me to Matthew Berry, who I read everything Matthew Berry wrote when I was kind of coming up in this space. And I remember the one common theme that he would always write in his articles was, I might not get every pick right. It's going to be a really hard path to tell you that I'm going to get picks right at a higher rate than everybody else who's doing really good work as well. There's not a lot of edge there to beat people at. But what I can do is I can be me, and I can be me better than anybody else. And that's the exact mantra that I've tried to do in all my work as well, is I've tried to just be myself. So when you hear my voice, when you read my content, I hope that people are thinking of me and have some sort of basis in their head built up of this is where this guy comes from on a lot of different characteristics, and you're going to get a consistent kind of outlet in that. And I think I definitely feel that with you. When I read Pat Mayo written content, I hear Pat Mayo talking to me just like I do on a podcast or a video cast.
Well, I talked to Brad Evans about this a little bit too, especially as it pertains to writing. If anyone wants to get into writing, it's not going to be the case for everyone because it's tough to do, but if you can't tell who the article is by after about 3 sentences, then you might want to change up what you're doing.
Yeah.
And you need time, and that's really the tricky part with fantasy, is that you can have all the time in the world. You can work for free as long as you want, if you can, but most people just simply cannot do that. I mean, you can start your blog and write on it every day. That's how I ended up getting into it. That's what I did. I just wrote every single day and just wrote, and eventually I developed a voice, but it took a really long time for that to happen. If you went back and looked the first things I wrote, they were fucking garbage.
It takes a while to build up the confidence in what you're doing to know exactly how you want to say it. You might have really good analysis, but if it's really good analysis that at the end of the article, somebody has to scroll down or scroll up to see who wrote it, at the end of the day, they're not always going to scroll up or scroll down, and they're not going to remember who that was, but they're going to remember the analysis. And so it takes a while to kind of find yourself in that writing experience. And I couldn't agree more with you there.
And in terms of the broadcasting side of things, obviously being entertaining, having good analysis is a part of the equation, but a lot of problems people, and like I'll try to listen to new podcasts that come around and some people send them to me and I'll give them a few notes on everything. But people that get into it right away have two big problems when it comes to either being on video, on the radio, or speaking on a podcast. They try to over-explain everything when, listen, I don't need 10 points. You sold me after 2 points. You don't need to tell me the 10th time around why this is. Eventually, I'm just going to tune out, like move on to something else. And B, just don't be afraid to be wrong. Everyone's wrong.
Yeah.
And if you're so scared that, especially like if it comes to something like a contrarian play, I think the audience, not everyone, but the audience is very educated to the point where they know that you're not going to be right about this every single time. But don't put yourself into a position where you won't say something because, hey, this might have a 40% chance of being true or a 60% chance of being true. But I know I could be wrong, so I'm not going to say it. I mean, in the end, and you kept alluding to this even when it came to selling packages and making picks and playing daily fantasy, this is all about entertainment when it boils down to it.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, that's what it should be. People should be buying packages and playing DFS because this is what they want to do with their time as opposed to like going to the movies or going out to dinner that night or whatever it is. And hopefully you can make some money on the side doing it as well. But that's not going to be the result for everybody. It's not how a zero-sum game works. But yeah, I'd say the one thing that turns me off when I listen to a new podcast or something is when I feel like someone's being disingenuous and trying to be a character that they are not. And so I think if you try to play up and be like somebody that's just out of character in terms of like the energy or the personality or something like that, that's what loses interest for me. So it goes back to kind of what I took from Matthew Berry, what I've taken from everybody that I've seen be successful in this industry is just really try to figure out and understand who you are and what kind of analysis you're going to give. For me, you're rarely going to get as a listener super high energy like rants and takes. Like it'll happen occasionally, like when the Bulls front office does something really stupid, I will get on and I will rant about it. But in most cases, you're going to get me at kind of this tone. You're going to get you're going to get some wordplay. You're going to get occasional like snarky responses, and you're generally going to try, at least what I think I am, is like provide thoughtful analysis on a number of different areas. And that's who I am. And if that doesn't mesh with you, if you're looking for somebody who's like more wild and kooky and entertaining, that's okay. I'm not going to connect with you trying to be that guy because I'm not that guy.
A few final things. Do you think that daily fantasy doesn't get the respect it deserves, not only within fantasy, but in the world at large, at the amount of jobs that it's ended up creating?
I think that's an overlooked point that people don't think of. And I think that was the limitation that fantasy had. I mean, season-long fantasy was always going to have a ceiling on it in terms of the number of jobs it could create for people. So I don't think people think of daily fantasy in that manner. I think so much of the daily fantasy industry has been focused on the gaming aspect as opposed to the entertainment value of the aspect that when you focus on the gaming aspect, you immediately have people that are focusing on how much you can win, and then you have people focusing on how much people can lose. Instead, this whole industry has really been created to give people another entertainment outlet. And when you create an entertainment industry, you create jobs and opportunities as well for people to be entertaining within that space as well. And so I do think that has been an overlooked aspect of the industry because you look around, just like my Twitter feed, there are so many more videos and personalities and analysis that I am seeing now because daily fantasy exists that I would never have seen if it was just seasonal fantasy.
Well, the biggest thing was always that in seasonal fantasy, you could write on the internet all you wanted, but the 95% of people weren't getting paid to do that. And that's always going to be a problem if you're looking to get in. You're going to have to wait it out. Like I worked 3.5 years for free while doing other jobs to be able to support that because I really like doing it, something that I wanted to do. And it really wasn't until I found video and became good at that I was able to start getting myself paid doing it and finding that niche. But with the influx of money that daily fantasy brought, it's opened up that pool that people can pay people now because there is money to go around. People will buy subscriptions. And I've always been very big, and this brings me to my final question. Do you need to be good at fantasy to write about fantasy or give analysis about fantasy. And one of the reasons that I keep my content free is because I have a very tough time, because I'm not the greatest fantasy player in the world. I'm better than that random guy you know, but when I compare myself to you when it comes to breaking some of this stuff down, especially as it pertains to daily fantasy, I'm just not on that level. So if you're going to be selling picks in my mind, or selling strategy, selling content, the people providing the content should be pretty good, or at least have a basic understanding of how everything works. Free content, I think it's more just about entertainment purposes only. Like, you're just clicking on it. If you trusted random guy on the internet for free, don't be shocked if it doesn't come back great in your favor. But do you have a, like, because there's a bunch of people I know that are in the fantasy industry, and I'll even include myself, that just slightly above, like, if you just took your general person who doesn't write about it and just plays like 5 season-long fantasy football leagues, the guy's probably as good at fantasy football as I am. I can just articulate it better and make it a presentable product. That's why I get to have the job and they don't. But when it comes to selling things, do you think there should be an emphasis placed on people winning? Not necessarily all the time, but being winning players.
Yeah, so I think it's a difficult balance, and I know that there's been an urge in the industry for people to like track these things and people to like out other people if they're losing consistently or whatnot. The first thing that I'll say to that is the natural variance associated with the payout structures that are currently in DFS being so top heavy makes it so that, I mean, you can go a while without winning and still be a good player who just isn't hitting the very top prize. And if you hit the top prize, it's like, if finishing first or second is a huge difference. It's oftentimes like 50% difference in terms of your payout. So I think the ways that people are trying to quantify and analyze things, when displayed without the context of the variance or the timeline associated with things, I think are really poorly done. And I think are done in just an effort to try to essentially shame people. And I don't think that's particularly helpful. I would say that I think there's a level of credibility that you need to have shown if you are charging for premium access, and there's a level of responsibility that you need to show that you are not only have had success in the past, but that you are still playing behind the recommendations that you're making. And so I think that's always been very important to me. It got so important to me at different times that I actually had to pull back and say, like, no, you can take slates off. It's okay to not play a day, instead of like rushing to try to make sure that you got lineups in that are representative of your content and different things. Because I was causing myself a little bit too much stress there, and I wasn't taking enough days off to really like reset myself. But I think it's important, if you're charging premium content subscriptions, to have some sort of credibility behind what you're doing, whether it's playing the projections and playing the picks and the recommendations you're doing, or what you've done in the past. When it is free content, I think there's a little bit more value placed on entertainment. But I think at the end of the day, with all of this stuff, if people are choosing to spend their dollars with you, and they choose it because you make great picks, or they choose it because you're really entertaining and they're a person that they like to listen to when they wake up in the morning, those are two different, very viable routes to paying a premium subscription for something. And that's okay if it's somebody that you find more entertaining than necessarily successful. I don't think that's the way that most people are going to make their decisions, but I think there are a small subset of people that are just going to make decisions of like, hey, I like this person. I just want to hang out with them. And this is my way for me to hang out with them on a given day, is to listen to them, do a podcast and then hang out with them in Slack and different things like that. And that's a very viable reason to spend entertainment dollars as well.
Yeah, and even the tools that are associated with some of these packages as well. You talked about being hesitant to have an optimizer for the longest time, but even when I see your guys' partnership with something like Data Golf, and one of the reasons that I've associated myself with Fantasy National is, like, I really do believe in their products, and my favorite thing about Fantasy National is that there's no picks on the site. It's a platform where if you're invested enough that you want to do research, it has all the data, all the tools, and makes everything really easy. That's why I really like that product so much. And I feel comfortable telling people about it. And I think that Data Golf presents a really cool product as well when it comes to analyzing strokes gained, probability charts, that kind of thing. I think tools are very important as the development. Would you have thought that so much when you guys started, 5 years ago now, that tools would be such an important part of this?
Man, I wish I had that vision. I didn't. When the first people that I remember talking to me about it in a really substantial way were Jonathan Bales and Peter Jennings, and they created Fantasy Labs, which ended up being a great product. It's still a great product for a lot of users to be able to do the research tools that they have to them. And so I think there's a lot of different values that can be created by these premium products, whether it's tools, whether it's recommendations, whether it's projections, whether it's entertainment value. And ultimately, if the customer is finding value in those for whatever they're paying and whatever they're charging, ultimately, the market will decide whether it's a good enough product or not. And so that's kind of how I feel about these things for the most part. I understand those people who are outside of the spectrum who want like accountability and credibility and different things like that, and they want to see results and they want to track results. And I think that's okay. I mean, in general, like you can go into any contest, any public contest that's a GPP, and you can export the file and you can see the players that I'm playing on a given basis. If you want to track that for other people, that's fine. But I think the way that a lot of that stuff is being framed in terms of trying to denigrate or shame people really shouldn't be what it's about. It's like back when I was in investment analysis, I was trying to make sure people were doing what they said they were doing. I wasn't necessarily trying to focus just on the results, because the idea was if their process was consistent and accountable and they were good long term, the results would eventually come. They might not come in the specific time frame you're looking at.
All right. Any final things you want to impart to the people on potential advice of getting into the industry, or even certain things to veer away from? Because I really do think you mentioned having a voice is really important. I think that being multifaceted, and whether if it's something like video production, understanding how to use a camera, understand lighting, understand how to frame yourself up, know how to edit, know how to use After Effects and Photoshop in order to build graphics, everything like that. But I think that understanding technology and even the ability to build apps or build different tools is such a huge part that no one ever talks about when we talk about fantasy.
Yeah, those are the two most important parts in the job spectrum kind of going forward, I think. Like people like me who have, given picks for a long time, that's probably going to be a tough way to break in. There's not a lot of room for it. It's also really tough to be better than everybody else doing that. I think the way to break in is going to be on, the video production side, on the tools creation side with the technology backgrounds. There's just a lot of really smart people who have created job opportunities through that by sites trying to create tools for people to use and different things like that. So in that respect, like the path that I've created is probably a little bit more of the dinosaur route. And there's definitely a lot more evolving ways to get in the community that involve being a little bit multi-purposed and involve a little bit more of the tech background as well.
Yeah, having that skill set, it's almost like a trade in a way. That's how I always looked at video production, whether you're a plumber, you're an electrician, you're a pipe fitter, knowing how to physically edit something or being a cameraman, it's just a trade. Being a lighting person is a trade. The performance aspect doesn't really go along with it, but if you have these tools, and that's how I was able to do it. I was able to put myself on video. Without my ability to put myself on video, no one else would have.
Yep, for sure.
So if you can build these tools and you can win off these tools, or you can show people like, hey, if you use these tools, you can be successful, and you might use them in a different way that I can, but then you can start speaking about those tools. And then if your end goal is to be a writer or be on camera or be a host of a podcast, I think that's a very interesting backdoor way into getting in.
Yeah, I think you're much more likely to get in front of the camera long-term and kind of doing the types of jobs that, I do now through all those back portals than you are to like straight get there right now. I think there's a path that some sites have created where like if you're a winning DFS player, you can like be known for being a winning DFS player and like come on and give your picks and stuff. But
that seems actually even harder though.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. The games keep getting harder, so it's harder to kind of go that route. But I think those opportunities are going to be fewer and far between, because as the games get harder, there's going to be fewer people to kind of fit that mold. So I think ultimately some of those back routes are probably the ways to ultimately get into this type of role if that's your dream job.
Drew Dinkmeyer, thanks for sharing your story and for your time today, dude. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. This is awesome. I love these types of interviews. I think they're really great to put a person behind a screen name in Daily Fantasy. I'm looking very much forward to the rest of the series.
Well, I mean, you're I wouldn't say you're co-founder because I haven't talked to Leone yet, but I got one with Colin Drew coming up, another Daily Roto guy too. So tell people about dailyroto.com. I know you've talked about it a little bit, but specifically for the course of the year, what are you guys offering?
Yeah, we offer premium packages for pretty much all the main sports: MLB, NBA, PGA, and golf, NFL, obviously. And we offer projections that are done by myself and Mike Leone, all the projection systems we've built. We offer optimizers now. We offer research tools, all on the site and all available. We've got a Slack channel that when you are a subscriber to the site, you get into the Slack channel and you've got access to myself and Mike and all the other subscribers who are chatting about the games, sweating the games together, tilting the games together, looking for ways to try to talk through DFS and kind of have that shared community aspect. So there's a lot of great features that we have over at dailyroto.com, and we'd love to have you join us.
Yeah. I mean, me specifically?
Yeah, you specifically, but anyone else out there listening as well.
We'll all go join, so we can just all go hang out together. Anyway, Drew, thank you so much for your time. Again, you can follow Drew on Twitter at Drew Dinkmeyer. You can follow myself on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at the PME. And remember, give the episode a like if you're watching on YouTube, or if you are listening, subscribe to the podcast, rate the podcast, help keep the podcast free. That's what you do when you rate and you give thumbs up or comment on it. Even if it's a negative comment, it actually helps out the show a lot more than you think. Anyway, this is the first part of a very long series of getting to know people within the daily fantasy industry and people with just really cool jobs that we're going to talk to. So thank you for watching. I'm Pat Mayo. I'll see you next time.
Mayo Experience! Experience!